Okay,
So
well,
it's time.
it's time, right? Okay, so welcome everyone. It's time. Welcome to the Center's speaker series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Carolyn Merrick, and I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion co-chair, as well as program coordinator here at the center. We have Kaki Dimuk speaking on getting comfortable with being uncomfortable this evening. Um, I'll be your Zoom host for this evening. Everyone will be muted throughout the presentations. You can put your questions in the chat and they'll be answered when Kaki is finished speaking. Enid Krieger, who will be our host this evening, she will field those to Kaki. Please also stick around. We have a survey at the end and we really appreciate you filling that out. Thank you in advance. It helps us a lot. You can also give me feedback by just clicking on that registration email, and that'll send an email to me with any feedback that's not in multiple choice form. You can certainly send that to me. Our executive director, Peter Thompson, has a scheduling conflict, and he asked me to share a few words with you. So first of all, we thank the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee for their hard work in putting together the third speaker series. Special thanks to Center member and DEI committee member Enid Krieger for creating these series and for procuring all the speakers. Also thanks to the speakers who are sharing with us their time and expertise at doing it at no cost. We're grateful to our speakers, our committees, and our volunteers who all make this center the wonderful place it is, and to all of our philanthropic friends who make it possible for us to provide all these programs we do that are a part of healthy aging and lifelong learning. So, here to introduce tonight's speaker is Enid Krieger herself.
Here I am. Hi, everybody. It is really great to see so many people here. You know, I keep saying that Zoom is just making me see all kinds of old friends, and I just love it. And I know that you all are feeling the way I do. I'm really missing that hour that we that we lost the other day. I'm still exhausted. I miss the hour, but I'm really happy that the weather's changing. People are being vaccinated, temperatures warming, and any day now, this pandemic is going to be behind us. Speaking of the pandemic, I recently read a book. It was entitled Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, written by Emmanuel Acho, who's a Nigerian American and a former linebacker with the Philadelphia Eagles. And in the book, he describes his belief that we've been experiencing a pandemic long before the coronavirus. It's an infection called racism. And he's of the belief the most important step toward finding a cure for that virus is to talk to each other, which is why we have created this speaker series. I really agree with him because talking is good, helps you clarify your thoughts, challenges you, lets you hear various options, form social bonds, helps you grow. And how can you get to know anybody if you don't talk to them? But for some reason, when a conversation is between two people who may or may not look alike, conversations that offer an opportunity to learn just a little bit more about ourselves can be very awkward. This evening's speaker, Kaki Dimuk, believes that it's important to talk to people who don't look like you, because this is how you build bridges. She believes that talking allows you to get to know people in a real and meaningful way, even if the topic makes you feel a little uncomfortable. The trick is that you have to be willing to experience that uncomfortable feeling, says Kaki. She says humans are always better together. One way she's affirming her beliefs is in her position as Director of Human Services for the City of Charlottesville. In that capacity, Kaki serves as an advisor to the city manager, and she works with all kinds of people. She works with people who are homeless, who have been incarcerated, who are poor, who may be struggling with substance abuse, and who very often don't look like her. She was born in Charlottesville, raised in North Garden, and I recently learned that she's an amazing artist who produces amazing paintings. And if you don't believe me, go to her website and look at some of that watercolor and pen and ink stuff she does. It is fabulous. Kaki holds a master's in social work from Columbia University, And with her background and experience, she has also been a valuable contributor to the Racial Equity Task Force here at the center. She describes herself as an extroverted introvert. Well, I don't believe that, but we'll see. Khaki.
Thank you so much, Enid, and thank you all for choosing to spend this Wednesday evening with this series. I will say that before I get started, I just want to say I think of one of the sort of best parts of 2020 was meeting Enid. I feel like we hit it off immediately and found lots and lots of common ground and lots of ways to laugh. And so I feel very privileged about that. And I want to thank the universe for introducing me to Enid last year. If you don't know Enid, you should find a way to get to know her. So I just want to say a few things before I'm going to do a PowerPoint. It's not a boring PowerPoint. There's interesting stuff in there, so don't tune out just because I said PowerPoint. I'm also going to ask for you all to participate, so prepare. So if you haven't got your chat open, please open your chat. I'm going to ask you to contribute in there in a couple of different ways. I am about to share this information with you based on my experience as a white woman with racial and economic privilege. I'm also giving this talk to you from my office in the city of Charlottesville, which is on unceded Monacan lands. It's important for me to say these things out loud because I have unearned advantages and privileges just simply by being white. And it is part of my commitment to doing this work with both humility and awareness that I move forward in having this conversation. I'm not an expert in DEI stuff, diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, but I am, I think, an expert in being a human. And I think that being an expert in being a human is what allows us to do this work and move from racial oblivion to racial responsibility. And I'll share more with you about that continuum as we get going. I do want to share a few things about what it means to be human and the ways that being human and the kinds of humans that we are that get in the way of being uncomfortable and having these kinds of difficult conversations. I'm going to share my screen now. It says starting share screen will stop other participants' computer sound. Is it okay to turn off the jazz now? Okay, cool.
Is it still on?
Well, I don't know. It just said it wanted to.
Yes,
make sure
please.
that I was aware. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So last year in this country, after the murder of George Floyd, we began a sort of public racial reckoning process. The process is ongoing in many of our institutions, our communities, our organizations, and hopefully in your households. A friend of mine calls 2020 the year we bought all the books. So particularly white women, and I know there's a lot of white women on this call, my guess is that you all have very similar shelf life at this point, including probably white fragility. I'm still here, becoming, stamped from the beginning, how to be an anti-racist, the workbook for how to be an anti-racist. Hopefully you also considered subtle acts of exclusion and the sum of us, and one that just came out, which I think is really awesome, and I hope that you all will consider buying it, and I'll bring it up, called The Black Friend. So you don't actually have to ask the Black people you know to educate you about racism. This group of people agrees to serve as your Black friend. Reading all these books was critical for us. They were important tools for broadening our understanding about our own biases, our own roles, and our culpability. But if you read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and you definitely should read How to Be an Anti-Racist, you know that the opposite of racism isn't non-racism. It's not nothing. The opposite of racism is anti-racism. And anti-racism requires us to not be silent, to not be quiet, to not be paralyzed. It requires us to move into action. And action requires that we get our faces out of those books and actually into engagements in our communities with each other. It's critical to do this so that our community can be safe and welcoming for everyone. So today I'm going to ask you to think really honestly about your patterns, to name your own vulnerabilities so that this conversation and future conversations can be real and meaningful. Be honest with yourself. Take little teeny tiny social risks on this Zoom, in the privacy of your own home or with the people you live with. Cultivate tiny amounts of courage. And I hope you'll walk away with some tips on how to get brave, to get into conversation, to take some action and make a difference. So this is what I hope we'll cover. I hope we'll talk about what makes you uncomfortable. I hope what we'll talk about is what it means to be human, what it means to be your own kind of unique human, because your strategies are the one that need to be employed. Provide you with some tools and strategies that will allow you to be your unique and fabulous self and still engage in difficult conversations that make you wiggly and weird and uncomfortable. Mostly, I don't want you to bail. I want to give you some tips so that you stay in it. And then I'd like to share some tips about talking about race when you walk around the world with white privilege. So this is the time, the first time for the chat. Please spend a minute or two thinking about what makes you uncomfortable. What kinds of events or occasions or conversations make you uncomfortable? Why do they make you uncomfortable? What about it makes you feel bad or weird, wiggly, like you want to bail? Take a few seconds to think about it and then type into the chat. Carolyn, I can't see the chat. Should I be able to see the chat?
I believe you should. But I can read it to you, or Enid can read it to you.
Okay, great. As they come in, if one of the two of you would read them, and then that will be for sure a way to, oh, there it is. I found the chat.
Okay.
Well, no, I didn't. I clicked on the chat, but I didn't find it.
All right.
It didn't show me, so please read.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Are you going to read, Carolyn, or shall
You
I?
go, Enid, you do it.
Okay, let's see. I'm going up to the top here. Says a lot. Wow. Okay, when there are, oh wait, I'm not at the very top. When there are in-jokes or cultural references that I don't understand, conducting employee reviews,
Yeah.
when people avoid dealing with issues that need to be addressed, when I walk into a space where it seems everyone else knows one another and I know no one.
Me too.
Fear of causing harm. When my views differ from close family. Talking to family about racism, but they don't think they are. That's a big one. When I don't know how the conversation will go, whether it's, it's unpredictable. Social environments that I have learned are threatening to my sense of self.
Run for
When I am unskillful in words and tumble into hurting someone in my family. Afraid of offending someone, being PC. I'm not quite sure what PC means.
Politically correct.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you. Wondering if what I'll say will somehow be offensive. Small talk. Awareness of majority discomfort with my presence. Encountering Black people in stores, wondering whether to engage or not. Change. Direct confrontation. Parties where I don't know many people. Being in a situation where I don't understand the rules of engagement. How to confront the implicit bias. When I talk to people who believe they have all the answers. Need to learn a different English language. When the different participants cannot understand each other, wildly different perspectives. I feel uncomfortable when asked to talk about what makes me uncomfortable.
Fair enough.
I feel uncomfortable dealing with racial anger. When others are being made to be uncomfortable. When I am caught off guard and haven't been able to comprehend something. I am uncomfortable when I do not know what I personally can do about racism. Afraid of saying something that is unkind, starting a friendly encounter with a person of color, fearing they will not be interested or suspicious. I don't know how to begin those uncomfortable conversations with people of color.
So there's a lot in common.
It goes on. There's a lot.
Yeah. So there's a lot in common, and I think there are three things that what I hear. Really, the unknown. So that makes people uncomfortable, not knowing how someone's going to receive you, or whether there's rules in the room that you don't know, but that's sort of not being a master of that domain, not knowing. And also, I think what I hear is a concern about hurting someone else. Right. We'll talk a little bit about sort of how that concern can be converted into actual care for that other person. Because if your concern for hurting someone else actually means you don't engage with them, that you're letting yourself off the hook. They're not getting anything from you, and you're not actually engaging them at all. You're comforting yourself in that process. I think most of the time we feel the most uncomfortable when we're experiencing both vulnerability and accountability at the same time. And our little lizard brains, our little amygdala in the back of our brains makes us generally behave in ways that are really maladaptive to having good cross-cultural communications with each other. So here's a couple of things we do. Humans run away. We avoid discomfort. We run for the hills. We get freaked out and we chicken out. We just bail. So I don't know if I can tell you exactly how many cocktail parties that I have been invited to, and I have felt warm and positive about being invited and really excited about going to somebody's house and what it meant in terms of the advancement of my friendship or connection with them, and then made it to their house and sat in front of their house for 45 minutes in my car before I drove back home, because I was so uncomfortable about getting out of the car to go into that setting. And I see that some of you actually wrote something similar in your chat, in the chat, that this idea of avoiding discomfort is sort of baked into who we are. And so we have to somehow find a way to overcome that. Another thing humans do is fight back. And we do this, we blame other people when we're threatened, we fight back, and we fight to win even when we know we're wrong. Ask your partner. Your partner knows this to be true, for sure. That sometimes we say we're in dialogue with each other, but in fact, what we're doing is what this man on the right is doing, and using his words to actually overtake the other person in the conversation. There's nothing about this conversation that is motivated by any kind of mutual curiosity or interest in knowing the other person. This is about defending the ego. We get emotionally hijacked pretty easily, and then we behave badly generally in that context. I will say that this was probably a pretty good strategy, both running for the hills and fighting back when we were like running from giant predators, or fighting over very rare resources, but they're not particularly good in creating a cross-cultural understanding and conversation. This is a slightly more nuanced thing that humans do. We make nice. So we seek reconciliation after tension. We want things to be okay. We try to minimize our own and each other's pain. Generally, of course, our intentions are very good about this. We want it to be okay. But quite often it's not okay. And quite often the person we're talking to doesn't feel okay. And we have to figure out a way to actually witness and be with somebody who is not okay. Sometimes we attempt to build bridges by identifying our shared emotional sort of human context. And so if somebody says, I feel sad about X, that somebody next to them might say, I have also been sad about X. And what they're trying to do is build some sort of emotional bridge. We have a shared experience. We have some sort of alignment with each other. But if you say, I'm also sad about X, what you have done is ignore that other person's act of vulnerability to you, to share with that. They have shared with you their sadness, and you have ignored it and then said something about yourself. So you've actually brought the conversation back to you. instead of inquiring about that other person's sadness, acting and being actually curious about how that other person is experiencing grief. In addition, you have said nothing that is a source of comfort to them. You have not said that you are willing to just be with them while they have this overwhelming feeling. Sometimes it can be really hard to sit with pain and to observe with empathy and to ask questions without actually doing much of talking about yourself. Again, our intentions are very good. My godmother, who may actually be one of the people who are logged on to this, is a marvelous human being. And many years ago, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she is a great student of the human experience, a social worker, and somebody who has sort of notices and tracks sort of human behaviors. And she did a lot of reporting out about how other people responded to her cancer diagnosis during that time. And it was a fascinating sort of thing that happened. And one of the things that happened is that suddenly people who were probably really good at what they did, landscaping or auto mechanics or booksellers, became medical experts. And so when she said, I have cancer, they said, well, they have so many treatments now. And they began to tell her about all the possible treatments, from shark fins to traditional stuff. And then they spoke with great authority about it. They talked, right? They kept talking, not allowing her an opportunity to talk about how it felt for her to have this diagnosis of breast cancer, or even inquire with any kind of curiosity about what her experience was. They kept talking, and they presented something that they were not. By talking about all of the treatments, they meant to offer solutions. But in fact, what they were doing is minimizing what was happening to her. By saying there's all kinds of things you can do about it, you shouldn't feel bad about being diagnosed with breast cancer. They were denying her the opportunity to have any sense of grief or fear. And then the other thing people told her was all of the stories that they had about somebody else's breast cancer, which is completely amazing. That it's like sort of like a matching game. Like, I have breast cancer. Oh, I know someone else who has breast cancer, and this is exactly what their experience has been. It's gonna be okay. And of course, they have no capacity whatsoever to know whether it's going to be okay. And more importantly, they weren't responding to the feeling that she was offering. This is a really nuanced thing that we do to avoid discomfort. And I think it's really important when we're talking about racism and we're talking about experiencing the harm that white people have done, that we're in a position where we try not to make nice, that we recognize the harm, we recognize the feeling, and we allow ourselves to sit with it. So one of the other things we do, and this is also pretty tricky, is forgiveness. And what's interesting about forgiveness is that we forgive ourselves first. This is amazing. So when something goes bad in a conversation, we generally say, well, my intentions were all terribly good. I was right and I was righteous in my start. And so something went awry, they heard it wrong, felt it wrong, interpreted it wrong, but that's not what I meant. And so we let ourselves off the hook. I said something on Monday that white women were cloaking themselves with the comfort of their own forgiveness, of forgiving themselves for their intentions. And I think that's true. And that allows us somehow not to recognize, acknowledge, be responsible for, or address the impact of some of the things we do. So let me give you an example of this. So these very strange, somehow clothing-free child men are walking, having a conversation, and one of them steps on the foot of a third one. And that person, quite reasonably, out of surprise and pain, says, ouch! And the person who did the stepping says, knock it off. It was unfair of you to yell at me. I didn't mean to step on your foot. And the person says, but you did step on my foot. This is such a great example, because the person who was like, I don't deserve to be yelled at, wants the focus to be on them and to forgive themselves for their intentions. But there is a very real person whose foot got stepped on. And so it's important to get out of our own way and recognize the impact. But somehow, when somebody harms us, we immediately blame them for their impact and want them to have been able to predict that what they did or said would hurt us. So again, a very human thing to do. There's nothing wrong with it, but knowing it means you have to find a way around it. So back to my uncomfortable trio here. How do you respond to being uncomfortable? We talked earlier in the chat about the ways in which the kinds of things that make you uncomfortable. What are your go-to strategies for responding to being uncomfortable? What are your all too human responses? Do you run for the hills? Do you get triggered and fight back? Do you use all of the opportunities, all of the strategies? What happens inside your body? What happens to your skin? What happens to your body temperature? What happens to your brains? Think about it for a minute and then type it into the chat. One of my strategies for feeling uncomfortable, it's not one I'm in control over, is that I turn bright red. And sometimes I stammer, which may very well happen in the next 45 minutes. Or I could have a hot flash and you won't get to know the difference, but I'll just turn bright red and be uncomfortable. And maybe Enid or Carolyn would be willing to read your responses.
Yep, I'm working on it.
Okay, no rush, just saying. I can't see.
Avoidance. Shut down into silence. Stop talking. I get quiet until I figure out what to do or say. Another shut down. Get quiet and feel physically anxious. Become quiet. Resistance, defensiveness. Leave the situation. Make nice, stop talking, leave and conciliate. Try to talk about it and I apologize. Clam up, run for the hills if I can. Shame, defensive, fight back, make nice. Avoidance is my go-to. Often withdrawal. At my best, acknowledging that I really feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I deep breathe. After decades of practice, I sit with it. Try to use humor to lighten the situation. Mm-hmm. Shallow breathing, go quiet, look for the exit. Mm-hmm. I turn red and my voice shakes. That's you.
That's me. Sorry, go ahead.
You want some more? There's lots of them. There's 27 additional ones.
I'll trust that you all will read them and find yourselves reflected. I'll just say that, again, it is very human. It is completely predictable. We have some of our go-to strategies. And because it's very human and because they're generally strategies that have helped us avoid something that we find uncomfortable, they're probably pretty easy for us to go to sort of sink back into this kind of strategy. And so overcoming that is actually going to be hard work. But it is also really critical work if we want to find a way to connect in a genuine way with each other. And that's across race and among race. It's across any kind of difference. And if we want to learn about how we harm each other, it's critical that we find a way to stop using these same kind of strategies. And even more important, if we want to stop harming each other, we absolutely have to figure out a way to stop using these strategies and actually stay in the connection. So feedback from Black staff in my department was very clear in the last year. When we gathered in groups to process Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's murders, white women, particularly all white staff, said, "How can I help? What can I do?" And then they said they felt paralyzed. They felt overwhelmed. They felt stuck. They were unable to say the right things. They were afraid they were going to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. They comforted themselves with this pain in some ways because that allowed themselves to get out of doing something. But what we heard from the Black staff was so loud, was so clear, so unambiguous. What they said was, your silence and your inaction is the biggest hurt. We believed you to be our colleagues. We believed you to be our allies. And here you are crying alone in your office and struggling with your own feelings, but somehow not taking action. What they asked us to do was to find a way to use our white privilege for good. They asked us to try something, and they asked us to learn and to speak up. So we talked a lot about courage. We talked about our own sort of personal courage. So I've been thinking about what courage is and how it shows up in the world. And last year I did a leadership workshop at Washington and Lee, and I had the opportunity, it was about cultivating courage. And so I had the opportunity to study the world of quotes around courage. And so I have 3 quotes selected for you for inspiration for courage. First is Cornel West. It takes tremendous discipline, takes tremendous courage to think for yourself, to examine yourself. The second is Coco Chanel, who knew? The most courageous act is still to think for yourself out loud. I think she's asking us to break from the pack. I think she's asking us to check our confirmation bias, to examine our own history, examine our behavior, inspect and interrogate our impact. She's asking us then to talk about it out loud with the people we care about. And then Mary Tyler Moore. Take chances, make mistakes. That's how you grow. Pain nourishes your courage. You have to fail in order to practice being brave. Practice failing means that you try a lot. So at some point you practice failing so well that you don't even notice that you're failing because you're learning from the experience and getting up and trying something new and different and moving forward. In our department in the last year, when we were working on these anti-racist skill building groups, I asked everyone in the department to create an anti-racist goal. And that goal would be something that was part of their performance appraisal at the end of the year, in which their performance, one of many things that they'd be measured against. This was a very hard task for people to do something that was genuine, thoughtful, and real. For many of the white staff, it was about learning and about taking some specific action. And for many of the Black staff, it was about self-care, which is a very reasonable anti-racist goal. If you're a Black person in our community, is taking care of yourself, managing and maintaining your boundaries so that you're safe and okay. One of our staff identified that one of her goals was going to be to promote and access primarily Black businesses in Charlottesville. She was going to use her economic privilege for good. So she identified a Black ophthalmologist in town. She was very excited. She went to go see this Black ophthalmologist. And then when we came together in our staff meeting, she said, you guys, I'm really excited. One of my anti-racist goals was to use my economic privilege to benefit Black businesses in town. And I found a Black ophthalmologist, and he was fantastic. He was awesome. And then she gave his name. It's fantastic. She felt really good about it. She felt like she had met her anti-racist goal. She had found somebody and promoted them. And Black staff and a couple of white staff circled back around and said to her, so it was kind of weird what you said. Because what you said was, he was great. And what it sounded like you were saying was, I was surprised to find out that this Black ophthalmologist was great. And they felt like it was actually something they were saying, essentially the ellipsis, he was great. And I was amazed, quote, 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 or dot, 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 for a Black man. So the Black staff received that very, very differently than her intended. She was a model for the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight. She received that feedback with grace and immediately incorporated that into a very heartfelt apology. She asked for no one to take care of her feelings. She took care of and managed her own feelings in her own world, and she learned immediately from it, and then began talking about the way that in which she had been the perpetrator of a microaggression, and immediately incorporated that in education for other staff. This is somebody who was comfortable failing, so comfortable that they were able to convert that into a learning experience for themselves and other people fairly quickly. So, courage. Courage is not one big, giant sort of firefighter moment. Courage is actually sort of 5 primary components. Authenticity, you have to really feel it. You can't fake courage. Emotional intelligence, this is really about how you pick the right moment, pick the right tone, pick the right opener. Self-discipline, managing your own feelings and boundaries in that process. Resilience, failing and coming back to it, failing and coming back to it. Commitment to purpose, so being intentional about what you're doing. I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 different methods for managing difficult conversations. They're not cumulative, they don't layer, they're just different approaches and used by different kinds of folks in the communities around the country who are talking about difficult conversations. The Difficult Conversations book by the Harvard Negotiation Project is my favorite, and I'll end with that one. But Glenn Singleton wrote this book called Courageous Conversations. It's mostly talking about race within the context of educational settings. And his 4 agreements are: stay engaged, experience discomfort, expect no resolution, expect non-closure, and commit to speaking your truth. This expecting non-closure is really, really hard. The idea that we end a conversation letting discomfort rule the day is often very hard. We want to have things be tidier than that. These conversations do not lend themselves to tidy endings. They're ongoing. They're sort of conversations that stop and then start and then stop and then start. And you have to be willing to sit with that in the in-between times as well. It's good motivation to wrestle with it, to be honest. Stanford uses this approach called the Lara approach. Listen with your heart, affirm with sensitivity, respond with respect, ask questions with the intent to learn. Respect, I think, is a really difficult word. I think a lot of people receive and experience respect very, very differently. It's a very unique kind of thing, and I think it's important to have rules around understanding how other people receive respect and how you would like to give it. So often that's about sort of pre-conversational agreements with somebody. I really like this ask questions with intent to learn. Again, this gets back to this idea of the curiosity, which I think is the key to understanding. And I use this image on purpose. The heart is described in lots of different ways. All of its little components are identified there. The heart is a very practical thing. It's a complicated thing. It's a feeling thing. It's a spiritual thing. And entering into these conversations, you can't have an academic mind about it. You have to come in there with your whole friggin' heart invested in it. And if you don't, people will be able to smell you're disingenuous. They'll be able to know that you're not really in it. So pay attention to your feelings, pay attention to the way your blood flows, pay attention to the care with which you started the conversation. Allow your heart to drive that. Your heart's likely not to get you in trouble. So there's a couple times when you should not have a difficult conversation with anyone ever, including at your home, including your family, including a police officer, including anyone that you're in conversation with. If you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, don't try to do something that's hard. Just don't. Go get yourself a snack, take a walk around the block, get some company, take a break. But when you're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, your brain is completely hijacked. And so you can't stay with this stuff. And so just remember it, halt. Another way to prepare for a difficult conversation, and this is based on the Difficult Conversations book from the Harvard Negotiation Project and Sheila Heen, who I really like. Their focus is really to be curious. So cultivate your curiosity before you enter the conversation. Listen to genuinely understand the other person's experience. Practice thinking about their experience, not yours. Slow down. Don't be in a hurry to have it over. Check yourself and remember your humanity. So in the Difficult Conversations book, they did all this research about the way we prepare for difficult conversations, and they said 80% of us focus our time thinking about what happened to us. 20% of our time is focused on how that made us feel. And they suggest that 100% of our time should be focused on what happened to the other person. the impact of what happened to them. And that if we can't find a way to be genuinely curious about that, we shouldn't enter the conversation yet. We should drum up that curiosity before we get started. White culture values efficiency, productivity, and completion. And it's hard to see those things because it's in our air. I know that Susan Bro, when she talked about white privilege, she talked about it as like the water inside a fishbowl, sort of everywhere all the time. The same kind of thing in thinking about sort of how white culture influences everything we do. It's in the way we run our businesses, it's in the way we expect conversations and products to go. We want things to be measurable, we want things to be completed. But often that gets in the way of us doing a harder piece of work, which is actually just stay in a difficult conversation with somebody over an extended period of time. And not saying this has to come to an end and we have to agree on something. So I'm asking you to just spend some time thinking how you can resist this idea of efficiency or productivity or completion when you're talking about engaging with another human being. They probably don't belong in there. Let conversations unroll at their own pace. Let them go unresolved. Sit with your anxiety and discomfort and let them percolate. I'm asking you to shift into a growth mindset. So if you look on the left-hand side is sort of a fixed mindset, and it talks about what's comfortable. I don't know where to start or what to say. I don't know any white woman who's ever not said this and said, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure how to start, and use that as an excuse not to start. But a growth mindset would say, first, I need to listen and read and watch. I need to go to the interwebs and I have to type in racism and I have to understand things. And then I will speak out against the injustice that I understand. I don't want to get it wrong or get called out. A growth mindset says, I'm going to make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. And I'm going to find a way to be grateful for the lesson. My staff person that I described did that really beautifully and elegantly. It won't make a difference what I do. Nothing is going to change. Things happen when I take risks and become part of something bigger. I don't get involved in politics. I don't have time. So this isn't a political issue. This is a human rights issue. And it matters. And a growth mindset would say it matters enough for me to take time. So there's a number of folks who are tracking continuums of change. A lot of them started with organizational or institutional continuums of change. There's a great continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural institution done by Georgetown University. It's really beautifully done. And now there are a number of folks, including Janet Helms, who did some of the primary research around sort of an awakening racial identity for white people as they have begun to understand their own whiteness and how it fits into the larger world. And so it generally moves from inaction and oblivion on the left-hand side to more of a growth mindset and racial responsibility on the right side. So racial oblivion generally looks like being exclusive, denying participation of some people and enforcing an exclusive status quo. Racial awareness means you're sort of growing in your understanding, but you're still taking a very passive stance. You're silent, you're tolerant of a few token friends of color, mostly declarations of confusion about what the problem really is. Racial sensitivity means that you're making some symbolic change, but still maybe some declarations of being colorblind, of focusing on your intentionality and not your impact. I'm talking about inclusivity, but actually not with much behavior change. If you find yourself in the middle, this middle half of this continuum, the green row tells you what are the things you can do to try to move out of that box. So your job is to learn everything you possibly can about racial inequality, grapple with the reality that there are literally no metrics of community well-being, individual well-being, family well-being, economic well-being in which white people don't come out on top as doing the best. and Black people don't come out as doing the worst. There could be no more compelling reason why it is that we need to understand the impact of racism in our country. If you look at that, there's no amount of a person being a problem or a neighborhood being a problem or a family being a problem that addresses that. And these people, the Racial Equity Justice Institute, have done this research, looked at community metrics of well-being in every major metropolitan and rural area in the United States. And there's only 2 areas in which they find that this dynamic doesn't show up. And that's with Latinx communities in the very Southwest, in which Latinx communities often come out on the bottom and Black people right on top of them. But there are 0 community metrics in the world, in the United States, of well-being or individual metrics of well-being in which white people don't come out on top. That's not an accident. And because we built it that way, we can unbuild it. And so that has to be compelling information for us to say, we need to restructure the way we provide services, the way we get services, the way we talk about stuff in this country. So find your way around that in the first half of this chart. And during this time, please resist the urge to ask the Black people you know to teach you about racism. This is not their job. This is absolutely not their job. Couldn't be anything more insulting. Do your own work. Hopefully you come to conversation that's genuine with them. Racial sensitivity sort of advanced includes some identity change. Understanding racism as a manufactured barrier to engagement and inclusion, and also active introspection. I suspect many people in this Zoom tonight are in this area. Please don't let guilt or shame that will no doubt come with your growing awareness keep you from doing the work, learning, or taking risks. And please resist the urge to ask Black people you know to take care of your feelings of culpability. It's, again, not their job to make you feel better about discovering that we live in a racist community and you have unearned racial privilege and racial advantage. The next phase is racial intentionality, which leads to some structural change in the way you operate in the world. It's much more action-oriented, challenges all aspects of personal and institutional racism. And you think about how you can use your privilege for good to disrupt the barriers, interrupt racism, and move from bystander to ally. Racial responsibility is a fully inclusive, multicultural, anti-racist perspective. And my guess is most of us probably can't do this, which is to actively work in community to eliminate all forms of oppression, to create multicultural organizations and communities. There's at least one organization in this community that came out saying about a year and a half ago to say that they wanted to become a genuinely true anti-racist organization. And as they began to unpack that and understand what that actually meant of them, they realized probably structurally they could never actually get to that place. And so they're struggling with what that means. How do they operate in the same world of nonprofit land or in philanthropy land and still meet the expectations of being a fully inclusive, multicultural, anti-racist organization? Finding it very hard to figure out how to do both. So I'm going to send you this link. We don't have time to talk about it because I think we'd like to talk about your questions, but I'll send you this link because it's a really good 15-minute description of this one woman's experience from racial oblivion to racial responsibility that ends with her yelling at somebody in the grocery store in the Walmart for saying her beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed child looks just like a doll baby. And she realized that she had grown to this place where she was interrupting racism when she yelled and said, the only reason my child looks like a doll baby is because we live in a community, we live in a society where all the doll babies look like blonde-haired, blue-eyed children. And if we lived in a community where all the doll babies actually reflected all the ways in which little girls actually look, then you would never say such a thing to me. Which of course was not a huge active racial justice work for her in the Walmart. It mostly made everyone really uncomfortable, but she realized that her brain had probably changed. So I'll send it to you all as part of the resources. I think you'll be able to have the whole thing, but thinking about white fragility, it's important to recognize when you get there. You're gonna get there. You're gonna go back there if you've already been there once. You'll find yourself feeling this, and it's really important. This is a kind of discomfort I really encourage you to get comfortable with and move past it. Do not allow this to stop you. But when people talk about white fragility, this is what it looks like. Mostly the taking umbrage part. where you start to feel a little bit like, I'm doing the best I can. That kind of thing, you know, you've sort of moved into a white fragility space. White fragility can be weaponized. And I've seen this happen in a number of places. And there's three things I want to call your attention to. Is one, this insisting on niceness. But a lot of conversation about the importance of civility. Civility is coded language for not letting people be righteously angry. And so that's both pathologizing Black anger and insisting on civil conversation is a way of shutting it down. The other I would like to talk about is crying. And we talk a lot about sort of white women crying and whether you're allowed to start crying in the middle of a conversation about racial reconciliation. And if you do start crying, that you don't ask anybody in the room to be your caretaker, that you don't stop having the conversation. Because for a long time, when white women decided to engage in the conversation, it was so uncomfortable that they did start crying, and then the whole conversation shut down and nobody moved forward. And so we had to agree that actually you're allowed to cry, you're allowed to have feelings, it's a terribly human thing, and you still need to engage in the conversation. Last year, after the murders, too many Black people in our community and the public conversation around it, Nike came out with an anti-racist statement. Staples came out with an anti-racist statement. There was a lot of good conversation in the community about whether this was performative or whether this was genuine. Performative just means you're faking it. Don't fake it. Be a real ally. Allow yourself to take risks, educate yourself, examine your privilege, and then use it, give it away, risk your privilege for good. Don't virtue signal. Don't think this is about you, because it's not. And this is one of the hardest things we have in the world because we're built like egocentrists, all of us. Really hard to get out of our own way and learn to sit with the discomfort. Tiffany Jana, who wrote a book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion, and is a sort of like a step 2 analysis of microaggressions. And I know you all had the lovely, talented, and genius Beverly Adams talk to you about microaggressions, maybe last year or the year before. So lucky you, because she's amazing at it. And Dr. Jana does a similar kind of work. And there's a couple of things that they have done about categorizing the impact of microaggressions. We tend to talk about microaggressions as one-time only events. We said a bad thing, we said something was misinterpreted, we spent a lot of time dissecting it, talking about it, come to some kind of resolution. But for Black people and other people who are othered in our community, they experience microaggressions all day long from multiple sources, constantly. And so the impact is not micro at all. And they talk about this sort of taxonomy for understanding the range of impacts of subtle acts of exclusion. You are invisible. You and people like you are inadequate. You are not an individual. You don't belong. You are not normal. You're a curiosity. You are a threat. And you are a burden. And if you can imagine, if that's the message that you're receiving from the community all the time, every day, all day, that actually might have a legitimate impact on the sense of yourself. It might change the way you see who you are and how you are in the world. That's why it's important enough for us to be brave enough to call it out. It's why it's important enough for us to receive information from other people and hear it and understand it when we're perpetrators. That's why it's important to be brave enough to move from silence into action. I'm going to read to you Dr. Jana's vision for the future because she allows us some hope about this. And for me, it's inspiration for being uncomfortable. If the sum total of our inclusive and exclusive choices shapes our reality, imagine the following possibility. Imagine a world where people no longer assume the worst about others based on how they look, act, or sound. Imagine a world full of thoughtful people who consider the impact of their words and actions before releasing them into the universe. In that world, equity becomes reality. Race, gender, class, age, ability, and dozens of other demographic characteristics cease to limit and define people's success, future, access, income, dreams, hopes, and outcomes. People are encouraged and expected to be exactly who they are. Each of us has the power to make others feel you are enough, you are an individual, you belong, you are normal, you are special, and you are safe. Let's explore the beauty and the diversity of the human experience and wholeheartedly exclaim to each other, I see you for who you are, what you bring, where you've been, and where you're from. And all of you is perfect, just the way you are. I can think of no more compelling reason that would compel us to get comfortable being uncomfortable than that. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then maybe we can talk.
I don't even know what to say. That was so fabulous. Your graphics were fabulous. The presentation was awesome. And you know what everyone is asking is, can they get a copy of your PowerPoint?
Of course, sure.
So everybody, the answer is of course. And the other thing everyone needs to know is that that this entire thing is being recorded. So you'll be able to pick up this presentation as well as all the other previous presentations we've had in our first two speaker series, as well as this one on the center website, where we have all of the YouTube videos. So, girl, you did it. You did it. Okay. Do we have any questions? Let me go here and see. All right, let's see. Oh, thank you, Kaki. We heard, this is from, let me go. Oh my goodness. It's so hard working this thing with my finger. You know, I don't have
Adrian Dent.
mouse.
Adrian Dent.
Okay, thanks. I don't have
Sure.
a mouse and I'm doing this with my finger and it's so awkward. Okay, Adrian Dent, let me just get back down to her because my finger went all the way up to the top. And I'm getting there. Be patient with me. Okay.
You know what, Enid, I can see the chat.
Well, if you can see it, please give it because I'm trying to find it.
It says, thank you, Kaki. We heard from Dr. Jana that the white progressive community is the most dangerous demographic in all of anti-racist work. Can you speak a brief moment about this? And I sure can. You know, if you think about the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, righteous as those women were and heroic as women like Gloria Steinem and Andrea Dworkin and others were in the world, they were very intentionally exclusive of Black women, both personally and organizationally. Black women were absolutely left out of the feminist movement and actually left out of multiple waves of the feminist movement, no matter what was said. And so this is a very similar kind of strategy, which is this idea of saying it's too hard to include Black people in our anti-racist progressive work, which is crazy, of course. That's an insane thing to think or say, which is why I think all of the processes that are healthy and good that are happening around this kind of racial reconciliation work are happening with a dual process. So it's happening on an institutional level. I want all of us to work together in this institution to move this anti-racist work forward. And all of the members of that committee that are working on anti-racist work are doing their own interpersonal work with each other. So nobody gets left out of that process. That is slow work, and that really does challenge this idea of the sort of white dominant cultures, like emphasis on efficiency or effectiveness or outcomes or completion, because I think that it doesn't go like this anymore. If we're doing it the right way, it's iterative and it goes like this and it goes over here and then it comes back here. And I'll tell you what, decision makers, like government decision makers and funders, have a very hard time with a pathway that looks like that. But in fact, the people who have done that kind of parallel process work where they're working interpersonally and they're working institutionally or with a community are doing it well. And they're actually getting to some outcomes that matter and take care of the human beings who are involved in that process. So I think it's important to advocate like crazy for time and space to do that work. Otherwise, we do become dangerous weapons. We become weirdly dangerous weapons while we're trying to do anti-racist work. It's crazy.
Right. Khaki,
Yeah.
So Liz Hacking has an 11-year-old granddaughter coming to visit, and she wants to talk about Black Lives Matter. Do you have any recommendations about talking about racism to young people?
In terms of tools, I don't have tools or resources, but I'll tell you what I bet the Jefferson Memorial Library does. And I'm certain that there's some very smarty pants librarians over there who would just be thrilled to have such a question. But I would ask her what she thinks and knows, because my guess is she thinks and knows an awful lot already. And I would just wind her up and let her talk. And I would probably do that in a way that it's a parallel play process where you're walking together and not looking at each other. So she has lots of opportunity to keep going, as opposed to looking at you for your reaction the whole time. I would just wind her up and let her go. I bet she knows a lot. And when she doesn't know something, you can add something to it. Yeah. What an exciting opportunity.
It is wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between being a white ally and a white savior?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So it's interesting. There is this strong sense of ownership or saviorship that I think white people have when they get into the movement. They think they know all there is to know. And so if they see a microaggression against somebody else, that Dr. Jana says there's a great opportunity to move from bystander to active ally. And what a great thing to be able to do. But also what an amazing thing to allow somebody who has had a microaggression perpetrated against them to speak up for themselves. And for you to stand behind them like a hype man with your arms crossed, shaking your head like crazy, but not actually stepping on their own path. And that's a subtle difference, but I think it's really critical to be able to say, and at some point to be able to say, hey, I'd like to fight this battle with you, for you. Is that okay? I'd like to join you in that. Is that going to be okay? Can you receive my help in a way that feels like an allyship? Or is my presence always going to be something that dominates? When I walk into a room as a white woman with both economic and racial privilege, I carry with me so much power that it overcomes any deficits that I have from having a uterus, from having a Jewish family, or from being a lesbian. It's so powerful. And so if I'm going to bring that to bear on behalf of a Black ally, I need to be able to say to them, is this going to be too much? Am I already going to take up all the air in the room just by showing up? Or is it actually going to feel supportive?
All right. Can you speak more about the organization that you spoke about and their difficulties specifically?
Which organization, I wonder?
Let's see.
My own, the Department of Human Services.
It could be your own, because there was another question having to do with how your staff is dealing with all these issues now.
We're doing this thing that I told you, this path that's all over the place. I mean, we're learning and growing, and we had this. So we did this anti-racist group for the last year, anti-racist skill building group for the last year. The first 6 months, we used the Everyday Democracy Dialogue to start that. And then we went on to do individual exercises where we shared information with each other that we had learned in our sort of own exploration and process. And it was really compelling. And two interesting things happened in the process. When we got to the end of this year, and then we looked back at our time across the year, generally feeling terribly self-satisfied. We know a lot of organizations aren't doing the kind of work we're doing. We felt really good about ourselves. And then we heard from the Black staff and they said, geez, Louise, we are exhausted. And we're like, why are you so tired? We've been doing all this energizing, great work. And they're like, well, because you really talked mostly about yourselves, and also you asked us to take care of you in the process. So even though we were intentional about not doing this, we said we weren't. We centered our whiteness in doing the anti-racist groups. So everything was about us. and our experience and the way it felt to us and what we were learning and how we were growing. And we asked our Black staff to do the emotional labor of carrying it for us. Completely unacceptable, not what we wanted to have happen. And not a failure either, but a mistake, and a mistake that we can say, now we see it, now we got to figure out a way to move forward in a different kind of way. Because what happened, it was that once people got the language of microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion, and they began to understand how they carry their power and privilege around in the room, they had a lot to apologize for. And so they sought out Black staff constantly to apologize. And then they wanted to process the apologies. They wanted to have feelings around the apologies. They wanted closure around the apologies. So our anti-racist group itself was probably okay. It was all of the peripheral stuff that happened around it once we authorized people to have these conversations with each other. And the Black staff were still not empowered enough to say, take care of your own self. That's good work for you to do, but find someone else to take care of your feelings, for crying out loud. Don't come to me. You aggrieved me. Why should I then also have to take care of your feelings? But the power dynamic is still skewed. And so that Black staff didn't feel like they could say no to that. And so when we finally asked them, hey, how's it going? They were like, we're super tired and we need you to take a break. So we took a break, but we're coming back to it, and we're hopefully coming back to it in a way that is designed differently. So our organization is in process, and what we're doing is committing to being uncomfortable and continuing to be uncomfortable with each other, and to hear messages like our great celebrated anti-racist skill building group didn't quite work. So we got to keep iterative process and keep moving on. So there's somebody who asked about the staff person who couldn't quite do it. And so they are generally actually pretty anti-racist in their approach to the world. And I will say that sort of, along that continuum, they're one of the folks who were sort of advanced to the right-hand side, but they made this mistake. And that's the point, is that we're always going to make mistakes, all of us. And so we have to be able to be sort of comfortable with ourselves, however and wherever that introspection happens, for you to examine it internally and say, dang it. Like the one day I bumped into white fragility. I was in my kitchen. I'm so grateful. I met white fragility when I was home and alone, because I was so embarrassed when I finally was like, oh my gosh, you're having a white fragility moment. And I was so grateful it wasn't in front of other people, but I found myself stopping around like, well, I'm the one with the authority. I'm the one who has to be able to say that. I was very defended. And it was very unlovely of me. And I was like, oh, that's what that is. I couldn't believe it. I was so grateful not to have witnesses. But I'm going to bump into that again. And I'm so glad to be able to recognize it and to recognize the cues and that sort of defensive posture. So I think it's really important that we know that we're going to make mistakes, and we be able to sort of identify them, learn from them, and roll with it. Yes, don't exhaust your Black friends. That's Beverly Adams. She's so smart. She's right there. She knows all the things. It's incredible, and it really is important that we not do that, because our Black friends want us to get it right, and so they're going to say yes to us when we ask for their help, and then we're gonna do harm in the asking for that. And so don't do it. Do your own work first. There's so many great books. There's a great book, I can't remember who the author is, but she wrote a great book probably 5 years ago saying, no, you can't touch my hair. And if you don't know why that's the answer to that question, go get that book. It's an amazing, very comprehensive and amusingly written book that really helps you figure that out.
Mm-hmm. So. Okay, so I'm going to take just one moment here to welcome Taylor Fromm. Taylor Fromm says that, is Taylor a male or a female? That's a kind of a name that can be any way. Welcome to Charlottesville, Taylor Fromm. And what I would suggest is that you stop in at the Senior Center and get all kinds of information about the center at Belvedere. And then you hear a little bit more about the anti-racism committees and the work that we're doing at the center to kind of turn ourselves around. So that's my suggestion, and welcome. Let's see, who else?
There is a wonderful book called So You Want to Talk About Race, and that's a great book, and you should definitely read that. But this book, No, You Can't Touch My Hair, is not written by that same person. It's different. So I'll find it and send it along with my resources afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
There we go. Phoebe Robinson. That's it. Thank you.
Anything else? Let's see.
I see a
Oh,
question.
Beverly Adams has put on, telling everyone we should read Stamped. All of this is going to be, we'll put all of this together and send it out
I'll
to
say that, reading Stamped, it will be the single biggest education you have about
absolutely.
the structure of American racism, which is
Right.
baked into our very Constitution. And if you're not comfortable with me saying that, then you need to read Stamped from the beginning. It doesn't mean you're not a patriot, doesn't mean you're not an American, but it does mean you understand how we got to the place where we are here. So it is dense. Gosh, it's not going to something you're going to read happily right before bed. And after people read Stamped from the beginning, they immediately asked Dr. Kennedy, "What are we supposed to do with all this information you just gave us?" Which is how to be an anti-racist came to be, or because he recognized that people wanted to move from that knowledge into action. I do think there's a company called the Groundwater and their Racial Equity Justice Institute, I think Reggie, and they do a training called the Groundwater Training, which is really a beautiful, elegant sort of step series of trainings, with the first one about really every single metric of community well-being and individual well-being that I was describing, in which Black people come out on the bottom and white people come out on the top, really is a tidal wave of data that will demonstrate to you that this is structural and that it needs to be acknowledged. And then the next phase of that training is the sort of 2-day training, which is based on the Stamped from the beginning, which is really about the sort of the organizational development of the United States as a racist institution, sort of baked into both its policy and its practice. Once you understand the impact on individual Black people in our community and you understand the structural component of it, you are compelled to figure out a way to take action in your life around that. So I would really advise both of those things. So yes, Blue Ocean is doing fantastic work. And I saw somebody talk about an uncomfortable conversation with a Black man who's both written a book and also is doing an ongoing podcast, which is really interesting. One of the strangest interviews he did was with Matthew McConaughey. And so it doesn't always go great, but there's always good conversation. It's always compelling. So before I retired, I worked in some very technical areas as a supervisor. I sought our minority communities, people of people of color, and women to hire. When I went recruiting at a historically Black college, I had difficulties finding qualified candidates. When I asked about this, was told that that's not necessarily a field for minorities. How can white people mentor people of color and women to encourage major in these science and engineering fields? I found people who work on the same projects and respect from friends and break down those racial barriers. Agreed. Actually, I think that whole idea of qualified candidates is coded language, and it really upsets me. There are plenty of qualified candidates. They may not want to work at your institution because your institution might not actually be all that safe for Black folks to be in. Whatever that institution is, I'm not calling out your particular one, but I will say that that if you run a local department of social services, which has a long and horrible racist history, and you're trying to recruit Black social workers, you will have had to have done quite a bit in your institution to make that look like a safe place to bring a Black social worker in. So they may very well know about your opening, but be choosing not to apply to that. That doesn't mean that there aren't qualified candidates for that. And I hear that a lot, that, well, we'd really like to have a diverse pool, but where are we going to get them? And part of that is actually about creating a safe context, safe and welcoming context for the interview itself, and also for the landing pad when you actually get the job, but also finding a way to do recruitment in a different way. And we really, very intentionally, I think it's an active responsibility for us. If most of the kids who we serve in our department are kids of color, the vast majority are Black, then it should also be true that our staff are Black. It's not the only way to build a bridge with people, but it is a really effective first step. And so we intentionally went out to try to recruit. And so we did go to historically Black colleges and universities. We went to lots of places, but it turns out that the best way for us to create a diverse pool was actually through word of mouth with relationships with people we already had. And so we began poaching. We began talking to people we knew who knew our work and say, hey, do you know of somebody who might be interested in the job? We'd love to have you come over, but if you don't, if you're not willing, do you know somebody else? And yes, I mean, Charlottesville DSS is diligently working to make the environment safe for everybody. And I do not say that as a criticism of DSS. I do say that both Department of Social Services, my own Department of Human Services, have a history that we need to actively attempt to redress in order to make it right with the community.
Ladies, there's a couple of questions ahead, and I know we're not going to get to all the questions, but Ina, do you mind if I read a couple that?
Not at all, please.
Okay, so we have, so often, this is from Taylor Stafford, so often we respond by offering economic help. In Charlottesville specifically, how can we move beyond that and do both and?
Yeah, I think that's the answer, is both and, because we have created a system where there's a huge economic wealth gap, where there's a huge opportunity gap, where there's an education gap. If you look at sort of the layers of those gaps, they add up to something that can be really impossible to overcome. And so we have an obligation to address the harm right now and begin to build the pipeline. And often what we have tolerance for, either because it's financial or because it's emotional or because it's about time, is one or the other. And so we say we can't deal with the crisis of now. We're going to try to build a better pipeline for the future. Which of course is not a moral choice. Or we say we're only going to staunch the flow of bleeding right now. We can't possibly think about going upstream to see what's causing this. But if we were really going to make a concerted effort at responding, we would address the whole thing. We would say there's a need for economic independence, particularly in Charlottesville, for Black families, and we're going to fix that by providing cash guaranteed income. That's what my choice would be. We're going to build a future where solid living wage employment is possible and provide all the structured supports in order to help those folks get there. We're also going to say there's something wrong with what we keep building in Charlottesville that keeps ending up with people in this position, and we're going to fix those structural problems. And if we don't choose to do all three, then we just are going to keep trying to do just enough as we go along. The same story is told around homelessness. The same story is told. I mean, there's so many things. If we have to invest in prevention, response, and transformation at the same time, and we rarely have a tolerance for that. Too bad.
There's one question here. Is there a respectful way for an organization to seek input regarding perceptions of the organization, doing its own work to understand how it is perceived by different people?
I think, this is a great example of an opportunity for participatory research. And so I would pay people for their opinions and their experiences. So that is one way of being respectful. If you have a lived experience that's important for me to know and understand, that it's important enough for me to pay you for that. And I think there's an opportunity to say, particularly for example, if you wanted to know what residents of West Haven think about something, then probably I'm not going to march in there with a bunch of white social workers and knock door to door and ask for people's experience. But if I don't have a relationship in that neighborhood, I'm going to find someone who does have a relationship in that neighborhood, and I'm going to use that relationship. I'm going to monetize that relationship probably to pay for their time and expertise and experience, and ask them to gather the information. So I think that is one way to get to that. It doesn't lend itself to the kind of quantitative research that we like, right? Again, sort of a standard value of white dominant culture is that we want things that are tried and true, that as opposed to saying that, we have X number of percentage, we can say, actually, we have 4 compelling stories. And even though there's only 4 stories, but they were compelling enough for us to tell us something that was meaningful for us to move to action. It's hard to make that shift to a qualitative piece of information and away from quantitative, but it's pretty important to do that, I think.
Here's another one. Is there a respectful way for an organization to seek input regarding perceptions of the organization, doing its own work, to understand how it is perceived by different people?
That's the one we just did, Carolyn.
I so apologize.
I'm just repeating because I think it's something the center wants to do. So
not a problem.
I highlighted the wrong one, and I was. Thank you, ladies, for letting me make the big mistake. Here's another one. That's not one you did. For many years, I've been a mentor for medical students for the center. There are a number who are Asian. The attitude towards Asians during the pandemic has been bad. and became more vicious after Atlanta. I feel I should contact the students individually, but don't know how to express my support. Any thoughts?
I think that's it. That's it. I wanted to contact you because I'm aware that something terrible is happening. And I want you to know that I'm thinking about you and offering you support in any of the ways that I can offer it. That's it. That's it. I wasn't sure how to approach you. It feels weird, but I feel like it's important enough to do. So I'm gonna push through the weird and do it anyway. I think
Right.
that would be amazing. You're not requiring a response from anyone. You're not requiring a caretaking. You're just extending the juju out into the world, and there's no better gift than to extend juju and not expect anything back.
Right. What can educators do during this unusual time to assist children of color who are falling through the cracks because of not accessing virtual learning?
You know, I'm going to say something that's so unpopular. Oh, gosh, do I dare say it? This has been a terrible year. It's been a terrible year. It's been an emotional challenge for all of us. And so I don't think anybody fell through any of the cracks. If you lived through the last year, you didn't fall through the cracks, period. Surviving the last year was our job. I don't think we were supposed to survive and make great strides at our jobs. I don't think we were meant to survive and get great grades. I think we were meant to just make it through. If you manage to do something else, like I painted my windowsills on the inside of my house, that was a huge accomplishment. That was March of last year, but I'm still hanging on to it because it was the one accomplishment I had. I think our jobs were to survive. And so the idea that somehow any one of our kids is going to be measured against their academic achievements in the last year seems like an absurd expectation for little minds that were grappling with some terrible realities about mortality. So I think it's a mistake for us to even think in terms of that. So if they were falling through the cracks before, that's one thing. But having this be some sort of a measurement for success for this year just feels really like an unbelievable burden to place on little minds.
Right. Edie Reed actually has something that bothers me sometimes. She writes, she was told that when she asked her boss at a homeless shelter why there were absolutely no people of color in leadership roles, the boss said that they could not be found. Her reaction was to keep looking. Well, that's my reaction when I've heard that a lot, that, well, we just can't find anybody to put in these roles. We just can't find anybody. We've got so many educated, well-prepared, full of experience Black people out here. You have to just look for them.
And here's the thing, I can't remember if there was a study that said why this is true, but if I publish, this is true not just for me personally, but if I publish an ad and I ask for a master's degree, I'm automatically going to get fewer Black candidates, even Black candidates with master's degrees, apply for that job. But if I published that same job with a requirement for a bachelor's degree, with a master's degree preferred, or X number of lived experience, or like practical experience in the field that can make up for that master's degree, I will get doctorates applying for my job. This is the cumulative effect of a lifetime of microaggressions and undervaluing self. So I have to build my job description in a way that welcomes the people to the job in my job description. And so if I know that's a characteristic, then I have to get away from this idea that a master's degree offers anything. I went to school with a great number of people who were first-class idiots who should not have master's degrees. And I'm sorry to say that. Idiots is too strong a word, and I regret it instantly. I'm just saying that there were a number of people that I would say that going to 2 years of a master's degree did not prepare them for a lifetime of helping other people. Right. And I would not want them to be any social worker attached to any member of my family. And so master's degree doesn't offer me anything. Somebody's 10 years of case management experience in a public housing neighborhood, ooh, that offers me something. And so I think it's also important for us to have a different understanding about what education is, and to honor lived experience and to honor different ways of knowing things than what we traditionally have. So I think it's really important that we broaden that. Otherwise, those folks are not going to walk in the door, and you're not going to hear somebody's incredible magical story in which they can completely translate that into helping others. So I advocate very strongly for getting rid of those requirements in our job descriptions to the extent that we're able.
That's great. I thought I saw a good one. Oh, something to ponder. Can we normalize not utilizing the word minority as it relates to Black people? It's triggering. It's still oppressive. It feels like a microaggression. I agree. There's nothing minor about us. How about using terms like underrepresented, marginalized, or just simply referring to us as Black people with the capital B and P? I love it.
Yeah.
That's great. I love it.
Capitalize the B on Black people. People do that. And also recognize that not all Black people are African Americans for sure. And so saying Black people, while sometimes that can make people uncomfortable, is in fact the most inclusive, respectful thing you can say. If you want to talk about all kinds of other people, you can say BIPOC people, so Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then it's important also to say, and queer people. So you combine a whole group of folks together when you're talking about people who are traditionally othered by the community. So I think it's really important. I will say that in Charlottesville, because of our history of slavery, because we have descendants of Thomas Jefferson slaves here, we have descendants of slaves who worked at UVA here in our community, because of Vinegar Hill and economic renewal, and because of the events of 2017, Black people are experiencing something that other people in our community are absolutely not. And so if I'm interested in focusing on addressing the biggest harm, then I need to be talking about Black people and Black people's safety and security. So that's why my focus is on racial reconciliation at the moment. It doesn't mean that there aren't other things that we're working on and other people to be focused on being included. The steps that we take to make sure that Black people are safe and welcome and included in our community are steps that will actually make sure that everybody is safe and welcome and included in our community.
That's fabulous. That ends our presentation. Is the polling over now, Carolyn?
It is. Thank you so much. It is finished.
Okay, so I know that Khaki can't hear you all, but please, everybody clap. She can see you, so clap, because she did an awesome, awesome job. And I thank you so much, Khaki, for agreeing to do this when, well, we talked about it and then I said, oh, good, good idea. I am so happy that you agreed to do this. We have so much more conversations that we can have about racism. We can never forget the Native Americans, and we can never forget, the Latinx. We can't forget anyone. There's a lot going on, but what's going on right now that the center is focusing on is the situation in our community having to do with Blacks and whites and history and the social injustices. And those are the things that we need your help to help us resolve some of these issues. Our final session, the one we have in April, is going to allow feedback. So you can start thinking about all of this information that you're getting and think about how you want to come together and talk about it so we can get your input to make our communities safe and a quality community for everyone. I thank all of you for attending this evening, and I hope to see you next Wednesday, same time, same place, for Allison Lenny, who will be presenting, do you have a Black friend or do you just know Black people? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Good night. You can start